I finally took my son to meet his deadbeat father after 8 years of silence. But when the door opened, the man staring back at us had no idea who we were. That's when I realized the truth about my son's father was a lie all along. There are moments in life that fundamentally alter your understanding of reality, moments when everything you thought you knew unravels in an instant. For me, that moment came when I took my 8-year-old son to meet the father he'd never known, knocked on the door at the address I'd memorized years ago, and came face to face with a complete stranger who had no idea who we were or why we were looking for someone named Marcus Williams. This is the story of how one attempted reunion revealed a 9-year deception, exposed truths I'd never questioned, and forced me to reconstruct my entire past while trying to protect my son's future. My name is Lauren, and I'm 32 years old. I've spent the last 8 years as a single mother to the most incredible little boy named Caleb. His father, or the man I believed was his father, was someone I'd known as Marcus Williams, a man I met when I was 23 and briefly dated before I got pregnant. When I told Marcus about the pregnancy, he initially seemed supportive, but within weeks he'd disappeared from my life completely. No calls, no texts, no forwarding address. He vanished as if he'd never existed, leaving me alone and pregnant at 23. I tried to find him. I called the number I had, but it was disconnected. I went to the apartment where he'd been living, but the landlord said Marcus had broken his lease and left no forwarding information. I searched social media, but his profiles had been deleted or deactivated. I even filed for child support through the state, providing all the information I had: his name, date of birth, social security number, and last known address. The case went nowhere because Marcus couldn't be located, and eventually it was closed as unfindable. I was hurt and angry, but I had a baby to prepare for and then to raise. I moved forward with my life, got support from my mother and close friends, and built a good life for Caleb and me. I worked as a paralegal, eventually advancing to a senior position that paid well enough to provide stability. Caleb grew up knowing his father wasn't in the picture, and as he got older, he started asking questions about why. I told Caleb the truth, or at least what I believed was the truth, that his father had left when he found out I was pregnant, that he'd chosen not to be part of Caleb's life, and that some people just aren't ready for the responsibility of parenthood. I tried to frame it in ways that wouldn't make Caleb feel rejected or unwanted, emphasizing that the problem was with his father's choices, not with Caleb. But I could see it hurt him anyway, the knowledge that his father had walked away. Caleb was a sensitive, thoughtful kid who felt things deeply. He'd see other kids with their dads at school events and sports games, and I could see the longing on his face. He'd ask questions about what Marcus looked like, whether they shared interests, whether his father ever thought about him. Each question was a knife in my heart because I had so few answers. I'd dated Marcus for only 3 months before getting pregnant, and while we'd been close during that time, I realized in retrospect how little I'd actually known about him. What I did know, I'd shared with Caleb. Marcus was tall with dark hair and brown eyes. He'd been funny and charming, working in sales for a tech company. He'd grown up in Michigan but had moved to Texas for work. He'd been an only child whose parents had both passed away when he was in his 20s. He'd loved classic rock music and action movies. These small details were all I could offer Caleb about half of his genetic heritage. As Caleb approached his 8th birthday, his questions about Marcus became more frequent and more pointed. He wanted to know if I'd really tried to find his father or if I'd just given up. He asked if Marcus knew where we were, if maybe he wanted to reach out but couldn't find us. He suggested that maybe there was a misunderstanding, that maybe Marcus didn't know Caleb existed or had been prevented from being involved somehow. The hope in Caleb's voice when he talked about these possibilities broke my heart. I didn't want to crush his hope, but I also didn't want him building unrealistic fantasies about a father who deliberately abandoned him. I told him I'd tried very hard to find Marcus when I was pregnant, that Marcus definitely knew about the pregnancy before he disappeared, and that if Marcus had wanted to be involved, he could have found ways to reach out over the years. But Caleb persisted. He said that maybe Marcus had changed, that people could grow and mature, that maybe now Marcus would want to know him. He begged me to try one more time to find his father, saying that he just wanted the chance to meet him once, even if it didn't lead to an ongoing relationship. He said he needed to know where he came from, who his father was, and why he'd been left behind. I agonized over whether to attempt finding Marcus again. Part of me thought it would only lead to more hurt for Caleb, either because Marcus would reject him again or because Marcus might be a negative influence. But another part of me understood Caleb's need to know, to have that meeting and those answers even if they weren't the answers he hoped for. I decided that if I could find Marcus, I'd give Caleb the opportunity to meet him once, with careful boundaries and preparation for potential disappointment. I hired a private investigator, something I couldn't have afforded 8 years ago but could manage now with my better salary. I provided all the information I had about Marcus Williams: full name, date of birth, social security number, physical description, previous address, previous employer, and the few personal details he'd shared with me. The investigator said it might take some time, but that with a social security number and other identifying information, most people could be located. 2 weeks later, the investigator called with an address. He said he'd found a Marcus Williams matching the information I'd provided, living about 45 minutes away in a suburb I'd never been to. The investigator said he'd verified it was the same person based on age and background. Marcus was apparently working as an operations manager at a logistics company, had no criminal record, and had been living at the same address for about 5 years. The investigator offered to do more surveillance or make initial contact, but I decided I wanted to approach Marcus directly. I spent a week preparing Caleb for the meeting. I explained that we'd found where his father lived and that we could go meet him if that's what Caleb truly wanted. I warned him that Marcus might not react the way we hoped, that he might not be interested in building a relationship, and that we needed to be prepared for disappointment. I told Caleb that no matter what happened, it wouldn't change the fact that he was loved and valued by me and by everyone who'd been part of his life. Caleb was excited but also nervous, asking constant questions about what to say, what Marcus might be like now, whether Marcus would be happy to see him. I had no good answers because I had no idea what to expect. The Marcus I'd known 9 years ago had been charming but ultimately unreliable, someone who'd seemed genuine but had disappeared without explanation. I didn't know if that person had changed or if he was fundamentally the same. On a Saturday morning, Caleb and I drove to the address the investigator had provided. It was a nice neighborhood with well-maintained houses, tree-lined streets, and the kind of suburban comfort I'd always wanted to provide for Caleb. The house itself was a modest 2-story with a neat lawn and a car in the driveway. I sat in my car for several minutes, building up courage while Caleb fidgeted beside me, equally nervous and excited. Finally, I took Caleb's hand and we walked up to the front door. I rang the doorbell, my heart pounding, trying to prepare for whatever version of Marcus might answer. I heard footsteps inside, and then the door opened. A man stood there, probably in his mid-30s, with light brown hair and blue eyes. He was wearing casual weekend clothes and had a coffee mug in his hand. He looked at us with polite curiosity, clearly wondering who we were and what we wanted. This man was not Marcus. This man looked nothing like the Marcus I'd dated 9 years ago. The Marcus I knew had been tall with dark hair and brown eyes, with a distinctive scar on his left cheek from a childhood accident. This man was average height with light hair and blue eyes, and no visible scars. He was a complete stranger. I stood there in shock, trying to process what I was seeing. The man smiled and asked if he could help us. I stammered something about looking for Marcus Williams, and the man said that yes, he was Marcus Williams. He asked if we'd met before, clearly not recognizing me at all. I told him my name was Lauren and asked if he'd lived in Texas about 9 years ago, if he'd worked in tech sales, if he'd ever been to the places I'd met the other Marcus. The man looked increasingly confused and said no to all of it. He said he'd lived in this suburb for over 10 years, had always worked in logistics, and had never worked in tech sales. He said he'd grown up in Texas and had never lived in Michigan. He said both his parents were alive and well and lived about 20 minutes away. With each detail that didn't match, my confusion and panic grew. Caleb was looking between me and the stranger with growing distress, sensing that something was very wrong. I apologized to the man for the confusion and said there must have been some mistake. He asked if I was okay, clearly concerned by how shaken I appeared. I thanked him and said we'd be fine, then walked back to the car with Caleb asking questions I couldn't answer. In the car, I sat gripping the steering wheel, trying to understand what had just happened. The investigator had found a Marcus Williams matching the identifying information I'd provided, but this wasn't the Marcus I'd known. Which meant either the investigator had made a terrible mistake, or the information I'd provided was wrong. And if the information was wrong, that meant the Marcus I'd known had given me false information about his identity. The implications were staggering and terrifying. If Marcus had lied about his name, what else had he lied about? His job, his background, his entire identity might have been fabricated. Which meant I had no idea who Caleb's father actually was. The man I'd been telling my son about for 8 years, the man whose name was on Caleb's birth certificate, might not exist at all. Caleb was crying in the passenger seat, asking what happened, why that wasn't his dad, where his real dad was. I had no answers. I told him there had been a mistake, that we'd go home and figure out what went wrong, that I was so sorry for the confusion and disappointment. But inside I was spiraling, realizing that I'd spent 9 years believing a lie, that I'd based my entire understanding of Caleb's paternity on information that might have all been false. When we got home, I called the private investigator and explained what had happened. He was defensive at first, insisting he'd found the right person based on the information provided. I explained that the Marcus Williams at that address was definitely not the person I'd been looking for, that nothing about him matched. The investigator asked me to verify the information I'd given him, and I read back the name, date of birth, social security number, and other details from the paperwork I'd filled out. The investigator was silent for a moment, then said something that made my blood run cold. He said that if all that information led to someone different, then the person I'd known had likely been using a fake identity. He said the social security number and birth date I'd provided were real and belonged to the man we just met, which meant the Marcus I'd dated had somehow obtained or stolen another person's information and used it to create a false identity. I felt sick. I'd dated someone, gotten pregnant by someone, whose real name I didn't even know. This man had deliberately deceived me about his most basic identifying information, had given me a fake identity complete with someone else's social security number, and had disappeared when I got pregnant, probably specifically to avoid being found. Caleb's biological father wasn't just absent, he was a ghost, someone who'd taken active steps to ensure he could never be traced. The investigator asked if I'd ever seen identification for Marcus, any documents that might have his real information. I thought back and realized with growing horror that I never had. Marcus had always paid cash, said he didn't believe in credit cards. When we'd gone places that required ID, he'd always gone in first or handled it himself. I'd thought he was being gentlemanly or old-fashioned, but now I realized he'd been preventing me from ever seeing identification that might reveal his deception. I asked the investigator what I should do now. He said my options were limited. Without knowing the person's real identity, there was no way to search for them. The false identity had been carefully constructed and deliberately used to avoid detection. I could file a police report for identity fraud, but without more information or evidence of financial crimes, it probably wouldn't lead anywhere. The man who'd gotten me pregnant had covered his tracks well. Over the next several days, I had to explain to Caleb, as gently as possible, that the man I'd told him was his father wasn't actually named Marcus Williams, that his biological father had lied about his identity, and that we might never be able to find him. Caleb struggled to understand how someone could lie about their name and who they were. He asked if anything I'd told him about his father was true, and I had to admit I didn't know. Everything Marcus had shared about himself might have been fabricated. I also had to deal with the legal implications. Caleb's birth certificate listed Marcus Williams as the father, but Marcus Williams wasn't actually his father, at least not that Marcus Williams. I consulted with an attorney who said I could file to have the father's name removed from the birth certificate or changed to unknown, but it would require paperwork and potentially a court appearance. The attorney also said that if I ever did identify the real father, pursuing child support would be complicated by years of false identity and lack of documentation. I contacted the man I'd mistakenly approached, the real Marcus Williams, to apologize and explain. He was understanding and sympathetic, saying he was sorry for what I was going through and hoped I found answers. He confirmed he'd never had his identity stolen as far as he knew, but after our conversation he'd be monitoring his credit and accounts more carefully. I thanked him for his patience and understanding, embarrassed that my situation had disrupted his Saturday morning. The hardest part was processing my own feelings of betrayal and foolishness. How had I been so thoroughly deceived? How had I dated someone for 3 months, gotten intimate enough to get pregnant, without ever verifying basic facts about their identity? I'd been young and trusting, but I still felt stupid and naive for being so easily manipulated. Someone had deliberately used me, had fabricated an entire identity to hide who they really were, and had abandoned me pregnant with the confidence that I'd never be able to find them. I also had to consider why someone would go to such elaborate lengths to hide their identity. Was Marcus, or whatever his real name was, married? Running from legal trouble? Hiding from someone? The deception suggested something more than just a guy who wasn't ready for commitment. Normal people who want to avoid responsibility might disappear and change their number, but they don't create elaborate false identities with stolen social security numbers. This suggested calculation and premeditation that was deeply disturbing. Caleb struggled with the revelation in ways I'd anticipated and ways I hadn't. He felt betrayed by the father he'd never met, who not only abandoned him but had done so while hiding behind a fake identity specifically to avoid ever being found. But he also felt betrayed by me, angry that I'd told him stories about a father who didn't exist, that I'd based everything on lies I'd never questioned. I tried to explain that I'd been deceived too, but Caleb was 8 and his hurt and anger needed a target. We started seeing a family therapist who specialized in children dealing with father absence and abandonment. The therapist helped Caleb process his feelings about having a father whose real name he didn't even know, whose actual identity was a mystery. The therapist also helped me work through my guilt and self-blame, helping me understand that I'd been the victim of deliberate deception and that none of this was my fault. My mother and close friends were shocked when I told them what had happened. Many of them remembered Marcus, or the man who'd called himself Marcus, and they all confirmed he'd seemed genuine and trustworthy. No one had suspected he was using a false identity. My best friend Simone said she'd always wondered why Marcus had disappeared so completely, and now it made sense. He'd been planning his exit from the beginning and had made sure to cover his tracks. I spent months going through old photos, texts, and memories, trying to find any clues to the mystery man's real identity. I looked at the few pictures I had of Marcus, trying to see if there was anything distinctive that might help identify him. I reread old messages looking for slip-ups or inconsistencies. I found nothing concrete, just a creeping realization that almost every fact Marcus had shared about himself had been generic and nonspecific, details that couldn't be verified and told me nothing real about who he was. The hardest question was whether to keep searching or to let it go. Part of me wanted answers, wanted to know who had fathered my child and why he'd gone to such lengths to remain hidden. But another part of me recognized that someone who'd fabricated an entire identity to avoid detection probably had good reasons for staying hidden, and those reasons might be dangerous. If Marcus was running from something or someone serious enough to require a fake identity, did I really want to find him and bring that into Caleb's life? I also had to consider what would happen if I did somehow find Marcus. Would I report him to the police for identity fraud? Would I try to pursue child support for the 8 years of expenses I'd covered alone? Would I demand answers about why he'd deceived me? Or would I just want to know his real name and move on? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that finding him might create more problems than it solved. About 6 months after the failed meeting, I made the decision to stop actively searching. I updated Caleb's birth certificate to list the father as unknown rather than Marcus Williams, a painful but honest correction. I told Caleb that we might never know his biological father's real identity, but that it didn't change who Caleb was or how much he was loved. I explained that family wasn't just about biology, that the people who chose to be in our lives and support us were the real family. Caleb struggled with acceptance at first, still hoping for answers that might never come. But gradually he started to understand that his worth wasn't tied to a father who'd chosen to be absent. He had me, his grandmother, his friends, his teachers and coaches. He had people who showed up for him consistently and loved him unconditionally. A biological father who'd lied about his identity and disappeared wasn't someone worth mourning. It's been 2 years now since that Saturday morning when I took Caleb to meet his father and found a stranger instead. Caleb is 10, and while he still has moments of sadness about not knowing his biological father, he's built a strong sense of self that isn't dependent on that missing piece. He knows his story now includes a father who used a false identity and disappeared, and while it's not the story either of us would have chosen, it's our truth. I've also made peace with it in my own way. I was deceived by someone who clearly had practice at deception, someone who'd probably done this before and might have done it since. I fell for an elaborate lie because I was young and trusting, and while I wish I'd been more cautious, I can't change the past. What I can do is use the experience to teach Caleb about trust, honesty, and the importance of knowing who people really are before letting them into your life. Sometimes I still wonder about the man I knew as Marcus. Who was he really? Why did he need a false identity? Was he running from something or someone? Did he have other children he'd abandoned after similar deceptions? Was anything about our relationship real or was I just a temporary diversion? I'll probably never have answers to these questions, and I've had to accept that uncertainty. What I do know is that taking Caleb to meet his deadbeat dad and finding a complete stranger at the door was somehow both the worst and best outcome. It was devastating to realize the depth of deception and to have no path forward to find Caleb's real father. But it was also clarifying, ending years of wondering and hoping, and allowing us both to stop searching for someone who deliberately made himself unfindable. I took my son to meet his father and the man at the door was a stranger, but in that moment I learned the truth I'd been living with a false understanding of for 9 years. And sometimes knowing the truth, no matter how painful, is better than believing a comfortable lie. We know now that Caleb's biological father is a mystery we may never solve, and we're building our lives around that truth rather than around false hope or incomplete information. It's not the story I wanted to tell my son about where he came from, but it's honest, and honesty is worth more than a comfortable fiction.